Imagine you log into your bank account, right? And you look at the screen and the balance has gone up.
Which is always a good feeling.
Exactly. You're feeling great. But then you go to the store and you realize there's this massive hidden tax that has just silently drained your actual purchasing power behind the scenes.
Yeah, so the number on the screen says you're richer, but your reality hasn't actually improved.
Right. Your ability to actually live a better life has been secretly eroded. Now, for everyone listening, I want you to imagine that tax isn't just on your money.
It's on everything.
Yes, it's on your health, your education, and your planet. And that is exactly what we are getting into today. Welcome to the Deep Dive. We are ripping open 30 years of the UN's human development data to expose these invisible taxes that are secretly eating away at human progress.
And it really is the ultimate illusion of momentum, you know?
Yeah.
We look at top-line economic growth, and we just sort of assume humanity is inevitably marching forward.
Right, the line always goes up.
But when you actually look under the hood of these specific metrics, when you look at the raw data from 1990 all the way to 2023, you realize the ground beneath our feet is significantly more fragile than we want to admit.
It is incredibly fragile. And that's the mission of today's deep dive. We've got an absolute mountain of data to go through. But to make this concrete for you, the listener, we aren't just going to float around in global averages all day.
No, that gets too abstract.
Way too abstract. So we're going to use a highly specific micro lens for this. We're looking at St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
Coded as VCT in the data tables.
Right, VCT. It's a small island developing state in the Caribbean, and it utterly defies the traditional economic gravity we're so used to seeing.
They really are a perfect case study for this.
They punch way above their weight class in human development while simultaneously staring down, honestly, some of the most acute vulnerabilities on the planet.
Because if you want to understand how a country can theoretically engineer its way out of poverty, and also see the absolute hard limits imposed by global inequality and climate change, you look at VCT.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Before we get into the weeds of VCT's strategy, we need to set the table with the global baseline.
The yardstick of humanity, essentially.
Exactly. And for the listeners who follow global economics, you already know we've largely moved past using raw GDP as the sole measure of a country's success.
Right. GDP is just too blunt of an instrument.
It just tells you how much money is moving, not how well people are living. So instead, this entire data set is anchored by the Human Development Index, the HDI.
And the HDI really was a revolutionary shift in how we quantify human flourishing. Instead of just asking, how much stuff is the economy producing, the HDI asks, what are the people actually capable of doing?
Which is a much better question.
It is, and it triangulates three core dimensions. First is health, which is measured by life expectancy.
Makes sense.
Second is knowledge, measured by both expected and mean years of schooling. And third is a decent standard of living, which is measured by gross national income, or GNI, per capita.
Okay, so health, knowledge, and standard of living, that's the HDI. But the UN didn't stop there, right? We have a whole arsenal of adjusted metrics in this stack of sources to help us spot those invisible taxes we were talking about.
Yeah, a whole alphabet soup of acronyms.
Right. So we've got the IHDI, which adjusts that baseline score for inequality, like how fairly is the pie actually shared.
Exactly.
Then we have the GDI and the GII, which specifically isolate gender gaps. Who gets left behind just based on sex?
And finally, the PHDI.
Right, the planetary pressures adjustment, basically the environmental cost of baking the economic pie in the first place.
Which is a crucial metric.
Yeah.
But if we start by looking at just the raw, unadjusted HDI over the last 30 years, the story it tells is genuinely triumphant.
It really is. I mean, looking at the data, in 1990, the global HDI was sitting at a meager 0.608. But by 2023, it had climbed to 0.756.
Which is massive.
I want to pause on that for a second, just to let the scale of that sink in for you listening. Going from 0.608 to 0.756, that is roughly a 25% increase in overall human development.
Over a 30-year climb.
Yeah, that is billions of people living longer, getting more years in a classroom, earning more money, all condensed into just over 3 decades.
It is arguably the most successful period of poverty alleviation and health expansion in our species' history.
Wow.
But yeah, the data also reveals a very stark anomaly.
The stumble.
Exactly, a moment where that seemingly inevitable upward trajectory just broke.
I'm looking right at the timeline here. If you picture a line chart, x-axis from 1990 to 2023, the line is just steadily climbing. But then you get to the 2020 to 2021 data.
And there's a red circle right there.
Right. The global HDI didn't just flatten out.
Okay.
Actively dropped from 0.745 down to 0.742.
It's the first time in the entire history of the index that we saw a consecutive global decline.
And obviously, we all know what the catalyst was there, the external shock of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Right. And to understand the mechanics of that drop, you have to look closely at the health dimension. Global life expectancy had been on this steady, decades-long march upward.
It went from 65.1 years in 1990 all the way into the low 70s. Right?
Yeah, but in 2021, it plunged down to 71.2 years.
Wow.
Now, it has since recovered to 73.4 years in 2023, but that plunge highlights a critical lesson about this data. Development is not an irreversible state of being.
That's the part that really grabs me. I tend to think of global progress like a ratchet. Like it clicks forward, it locks into place, and you just can't easily spin it backward.
A lot of people assume that.
But this data says, no, progress is highly conditional. It's like a marathon runner who has maintained a steady pace for 20 miles and then suddenly trips and falls backward. So what does this all mean for the big picture?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it tells us that without structural resilience, external shocks, whether they are biological like a pandemic or environmental like climate change, can instantly erase years of hard-won human capital.
It's terrifying when you frame it that way.
It is, which makes our case study incredibly relevant here.
Right, let's zoom in on St. Vincent the Grenadines, VCT. Because if anyone understands vulnerability to external shocks, it's a small island developing state.
Oh, absolutely.
And looking at their numbers, they disrupt the classic narrative that human development is just a byproduct of having a massive economic engine.
The contrast is fascinating. In 2023, VCT achieved an HDI score of 0.798.
0.798.
Yeah, and out of the 203 countries and territories measured, they rank 78th globally.
Which is great. That firmly places them in the high human development tier.
They're essentially knocking on the door of the very high development category.
But here's where my brain snagged on the data. Let's look at the standard of living metric. The global average gross national income, the GNI per capita, is $20,327.
Right, the global average.
But VCT's GNI is significantly lower.
Yeah.
It's $17,247.
Yes.
They are trailing the global average in raw economic output by over $3,000 per person.
Exactly.
So here's where it gets really interesting. How does a country with a below-average income pull off an above-average human development ranking? Where is the hidden leverage here?
It's a great question.
Because if this were just a wealth contest, VCT should be ranked way lower. It's like a sports team with a fraction of the payroll somehow beating these billionaire-backed franchises.
Yeah.
How are they doing it?
The leverage is entirely found in how they've engineered their human capital.
Okay, explain that.
Because the HDI is a composite index, a country can actually offset a weaker economic engine by deliberately overperforming in the non-economic dimensions.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, VCT has aggressively decoupled human flourishing from raw economic output by heavily subsidizing education and health infrastructure.
So they are over-indexing on the other variables to pull their average up.
Precisely. They're using human capital to compensate for a smaller economic footprint.
Okay, let's dig into the mechanics of that, specifically the education data, because the numbers here are wild.
They really are.
So the HDI uses two main metrics for education. Expected years of schooling, which is a forward-looking prediction for a child entering school today.
Right.
And mean years of schooling, which is the historical reality of the current adult population.
Right. So globally, the expected years of schooling is 13.04 years.
Okay.
But in VCT, they expect a child entering the system to receive 16.25 years of education.
16.25. That is more than 3 full years above the global average.
It is. We are talking about an expectation of not just finishing secondary school, but completing university or advanced vocational training.
That's incredible. And what about the adult population, the mean years?
That also beats the global average. The global mean years of schooling is 8.77 years. In VCT, it's 11.30 years.
Okay, hold on. Let's look at this visually. Imagine a double bar graph for VCT. You've got 16.25 expected years on one side versus 11.30 mean years on the other.
Yeah, there's a significant gap.
That is nearly a 5-year gap between what the kids are projected to do and what the adults have actually done. So could that gap just mean their education system is highly inefficient?
How do you mean?
Like, what if kids are just repeating grades or staying in school simply because there are no actual jobs in the local economy to graduate into? Are we sure this is a deliberate strategy and not just economic stagnation trapping kids in classrooms?
That is a very sharp question, and honestly, it's a common critique when analyzing developing economies.
Right, because time in school doesn't always equal learning.
Exactly. A high expected years number can sometimes mask systemic inefficiencies. However, when you cross-reference VCT's high HDI rank and their actual literacy outcomes, it points strongly to a deliberate generational shift rather than a systemic failure.
So it's a feature, not a bug.
Largely, yes. What's fascinating here is that the mean years of schooling represents the existing stock of education in the workforce, the historical baseline,
Okay.
while the expected years represents a massive new flow of investment. VCT is currently in a transition phase. They are stockpiling an immense amount of human capital in their youth cohort.
I love that phrase, stockpiling human capital.
Yeah, they are betting that as this highly educated generation matures and fully integrates into the workforce, it will eventually close that $3,000 income gap we mentioned earlier.
It makes total sense. You educate your way out of an economic disadvantage. You build the engine for tomorrow.
Exactly.
But as we dive deeper into these sources, we hit a massive structural wall.
Yeah, the data takes a turn here.
It really does.
Yeah.
If we operate under the assumption that more education automatically equals more income, the gender data completely shatters that logic.
This is where we have to look at the Gender Development Index, the GDI, and the Gender Inequality Index, the GII.
Right. We need to see who is actually cashing in on this human capital.
Well, let's look at the global baseline first.
Yeah.
The global GDI sits at 0.955.
0.955. Now, in this index, 1.0 represents perfect parity between men and women.
Right.
So 0.955 looks incredibly close. You see that top line number and think, wow, we've almost solved this.
It looks like a huge victory.
But the way this index is constructed hides a glaring paradox.
Because the GDI aggregates health, education, and income, a surplus in one area can mathematically mask a massive deficit in another.
Oh, so they cancel each other out in the average.
Exactly. If we isolate just the education dimension globally, the scale hasn't just balanced, it has actually tipped.
Wait, really?
Yeah. Globally, women now have higher expected years of schooling than men. It's 13.0, 9 years for women versus 12.9 years for men.
So women are mathematically more educated on a global scale.
They are.
But then you look at the income dimension. The global female gross national income is $14,943.
Okay.
And the male GNI is $25,751.
A difference of nearly $11,000.
I want you listening to picture a vintage balancing scale in your mind, but understand that the fulcrum, the pivot point in the middle, is fundamentally rigged.
That's a great way to visualize it.
On the left side, you have education. The women's side is heavier. They are putting in more years, doing more coursework. But on the right side, the income side, the men's side, is slammed down to the floor.
Yeah.
You do the exact same homework, you stay in school longer, you get the same or better degrees.
Right.
But because the structural fulcrum of the economy is off-center, you graduate into a reality that arbitrarily values your output at $10,000 less.
It's jarring. And to understand the mechanism behind that rigged fulcrum, you have to look at the labor force participation rates.
Break those down for us.
Globally, male labor force participation is 74.12%. Female participation is only 48.47%.
Let's just let that breathe for a second. That is a 25.6% gap.
It's massive.
In a global population of 8 billion people, a 25.6% gap represents hundreds of millions of adult women.
It is arguably the world's largest uncashed economic check. Millions of highly educated women are structurally locked out of the formal, measured economy.
And this isn't because they choose to do nothing, right?
No, absolutely not. It's heavily driven by the unequal burden of unpaid care work, lack of childcare infrastructure, and systemic biases in hiring.
Right.
The economic mechanism here is a massive misallocation of resources. We spend decades funding the education of half the population and then structurally block them from generating a return on that investment.
And returning to our case study, VCT is not immune to this, are they?
Unfortunately, no.
Despite pushing that incredible 16.5 expected years of schooling, their local data reveals deeply entrenched hurdles for women.
The Gender Inequality Index highlights the structural barriers holding women back from political and economic power in VCT. For example, let's look at the highest levels of decision-making.
Okay.
Globally, women currently hold 26.5% of parliamentary seats. Still far from parity, but it's growing.
Right.
In VCT, women hold an astonishingly low 1.2% of parliamentary seats.
1.2%.
Wow.
Out of every 100 people sitting at the table, drafting the laws, writing the budgets, directing the economy, women barely have one seat.
Basically one person.
How do you translate your educational advantage into economic reality if you have zero leverage over the laws governing that economy?
You don't. You really can't. And the health metrics in the GII show further systemic vulnerabilities for VCT.
What do those look like?
Well, they have an adolescent birth rate of 42.3 per 1,000 women ages 15 to 19.
Wow, okay.
And a maternal mortality ratio of 61 deaths per 100,000 live births.
And those aren't just public health tragedies. Those are massive economic anchors, right?
Precisely. High adolescent birth rates pull young women directly out of that 16-year educational pipeline we were just praising.
It just cuts it short.
It disrupts their human capital accumulation entirely. And maternal mortality is the ultimate indicator of gaps in a country's foundational healthcare infrastructure.
Right. If you can't keep mothers alive, the system is fundamentally broken.
So even with a stockpiled youth advantage, if the structural reality on the ground, from the hospital to the parliament, is hostile to women's participation, the economic engine will always misfire.
It's infuriating when you see the numbers laid out like that. It's like building a high-performance sports car and then just filling the gas tank with sand.
That's exactly what it is.
But if the gender gap is a massive structural leak in our progress, we now need to pivot to the absolute apex predator of human development.
Yep.
The invisible tax that affects absolutely everyone, regardless of gender. Inequality.
We are moving into the IHDI, the Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index.
This is the metric that strips away the comforting illusion of averages.
Right.
Because if a billionaire walks into a room with 9 people who have nothing, the average wealth in that room suddenly looks fantastic.
Right. Everyone's a millionaire on paper.
Exactly. But the reality for 90% of the people in that room hasn't changed at all. So we established earlier that the global HDI is a very respectable 0.756.
Yes.
But the moment the UN adjusts that number to account for how fairly those gains are actually distributed, the global score violently drops to 0.590.
That adjustment translates to an overall aggregate loss of 21.96%.
Almost 22%. Almost a fifth of all human progress, the wealth, the medical advancements, the schools, is functionally a mirage for the vast majority of the planet.
To understand why it's a penalty, we need to move away from visualizing this as just a line on a graph dropping down.
Yeah, let's rethink the visual. I want you to imagine a waterfall chart. Or better yet, let's compare the global economy to a massive, intricate irrigation system.
I like that.
The total HDI, that 0.756 score, is the massive reservoir at the very top of the hill. It represents all the water we've managed to collect as a species.
Right, the total potential.
But the IHDI measures what actually reaches the crops at the bottom.
Yeah.
And the data shows us that the main distribution pipes are riddled with massive structural holes.
Huge leaks.
The water is bleeding out into the soil around the estates of the ultra-wealthy, while the working-class crops at the end of the line are still suffering from drought.
And the data actually gives us the exact anatomy of those leaks in the pipe. We can see precisely which inequalities are doing the most damage.
Break down the leaks for us. Where exactly is this 22% progress bleeding out?
Well, looking at the 3 dimensions, the loss in life expectancy due to inequality is 12.92%.
Okay, so almost 13% of the health progress is lost.
Right. This means access to life-saving healthcare, clean water, and safe working conditions is highly concentrated, which is literally costing us years of collective human life.
And the education week.
The loss in education is much worse at 21.46%.
Wow.
The quality of a child's school and their ability to stay in it is still heavily dictated by the geographic and economic lottery of their birth.
Okay, so 12.9% lost in health, 21.4% lost in education. But the biggest hole in the pipe is the third one, isn't it?
Yes. The primary driver of the inequality penalty, the apex predator, as you called it, is income inequality, which accounts for a staggering 30.35% loss.
A 30% loss. Let's get into the mechanics of that. Why is income inequality so much more destructive than the other two?
Because income inequality is the economic gravity that drags down the other dimensions.
How so?
When wealth concentrates at the very top, it fundamentally alters capital access. The lower and middle quintiles of a population are starved of credit and disposable income.
Right, they're living paycheck to paycheck, or worse.
Exactly. And when they lack disposable income, local economic velocity stalls. Small businesses can't thrive because their neighbors literally can't afford to buy from them.
The money stops moving.
Furthermore, severe income inequality allows the wealthy to essentially secede from public systems.
Oh, that's a huge point.
They buy private, elite schooling and private health care, which reduces the political will to fund the public education and health systems that the majority rely on.
Because the people with the power don't use the public systems anyway.
Exactly. So that 30.35% loss in income actively creates the 21% loss in education and the 13% loss in health.
It's a cascading failure.
Yeah.
If inequality is the tax we levy on each other, the final piece of the puzzle represents the tax we are levying on the Earth itself.
Yes.
Which brings us to the newest and, frankly, most terrifying metric in the UN stack.
The PHDI, the planetary pressures adjusted HDR.
This metric forces a brutally honest accounting of our progress.
It asks a very uncomfortable question. Are we achieving our high standard of living by essentially cannibalizing our own future?
Let's talk about how this is actually calculated, because it's brilliant. The UN doesn't just subtract a random number for pollution.
No, it's highly specific.
They take a country's HDI score and heavily discount it based on two main environmental factors: carbon dioxide emissions per capita and material footprint per capita.
Right, which measures the sheer tonnage of biomass, fossil fuels, metal ores, and non-metallic minerals a country extracts and consumes.
So it's about the physical stuff we are ripping out of the ground to fuel our lifestyles.
When you mathematically integrate those environmental costs into the global development score, the illusion of consequence-free growth shatters completely.
Give us the numbers.
Factoring in planetary pressures shrinks global development by another 10.05%.
10%.
Yeah. The global index value drops from 0.756 all the way down to 0.680.
I look at this and I picture someone throwing the most lavish, incredible party imaginable.
Okay.
The food is incredible. The band is amazing. The decorations are top tier. If you only measure the standard of living inside the party, the regular HDI, it looks like a massive success.
Everyone's having a great time.
Exactly. But then you realize the host is funding the entire event using a stolen credit card with an astronomical interest rate.
Yeah.
The PHDI is the UN finally sliding the bill under the door. And the interest rate on that bill, the climate impacts, the extreme weather, the resource depletion, is compounding so fast that it wipes out a tenth of the perceived value of the progress we've made.
That is a perfect analogy. And this brings us full circle to our case study, St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
Right.
Because when you look at the PHDI data on a country-by-country basis, it exposes a profound geopolitical injustice. We have to look at the per capita footprints here.
The numbers here are just completely asymmetrical.
They are.
The global average for carbon dioxide emissions is 4.54 tons per person. But what is it in VCT?
In VCT, carbon emissions are only 2.29 tons per capita.
2.29.
That is roughly half the global average.
And regarding the material footprint, the sheer extraction of physical resources to support a lifestyle, the global average is a massive 12.71 tons per capita.
And VCT's footprint is a fraction of that.
So VCT is not the one running up the bill on the stolen credit card.
No, they are absolutely not.
They aren't the ones driving the planetary pressure.
But this is the crucial mechanical failure of global development. The countries that generate the most planetary pressure are rarely the first to pay the physical costs.
Wow, say that again.
The countries generating the pressure aren't the ones paying the physical costs. As a small island developing state, VCT is on the literal front lines of climate fragility.
Right, because of where they are geographically.
Exactly. They are staring down rising sea levels, ocean acidification destroying their fisheries, and a drastic increase in the frequency and intensity of hurricanes.
A single Category 5 hurricane can wipe out a decade of GDP for a small island nation in 24 hours.
In a single...
That is the physical manifestation of the PHDI penalty. VCT is living with the catastrophic consequences of an industrial party they barely even attended.
Yeah.
They have half the emissions, but they face double the existential threat.
It is the ultimate tragedy of the commons, but captured in empirical data. The nations that sit at the very top of the unadjusted HDI rankings achieved that status through centuries of unrestricted carbon emission and resource extraction.
They built their wealth by burning the cheap stuff.
Right. And now that accumulated planetary debt directly threatens the survival of nations like VCT, who are desperately trying to develop through human capital rather than environmental exploitation.
So how do we synthesize all of this? We started this deep dive looking at a genuinely incredible success story, a 25% increase in global human development over 30 years.
A historic climb.
But once we applied the UN's diagnostic metrics, we saw the invisible taxes.
We saw the leaks.
We saw how the gender gap effectively nullifies the economic potential of hundreds of millions of educated women. We saw the inequality penalty / total global progress by 22%, driven overwhelmingly by wealth concentration.
And we saw the planetary cost wipe out another 10% of our gains.
When you compound the structural inequality and the environmental degradation, you are looking at a reality where over 30% of humanity's aggregate progress is just lost.
Shaved right off the top. But, the data doesn't just offer an autopsy of our failures. It also provides a blueprint for resilience.
And VCT is the model for that blueprint, isn't it?
Despite their acute vulnerability, VCT proves that stockpiling human capital is the most potent defense against an unequal global system. Their 16.25 expected years of schooling is a masterclass in long-term survival strategy.
So what's the next step for them?
The directive now for VCT and the rest of the developing world is to ruthlessly clear the path for that educated youth cohort. They must dismantle the structural barriers to close the gender income gap.
Right. You can't have women holding only 1.2% of the political power.
Exactly. They need those highly educated women sitting in the 98% of parliamentary seats they are currently excluded from. And they must utilize that knowledge base to pioneer green, sustainable industries that bypass the carbon-heavy development models of the 20th century.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We need to completely reframe what growth looks like. I want you to picture three distinct forces: equality, low-carbon innovation, and knowledge.
3 arrows.
Right, 3 arrows. We need to stop treating those as secondary goals or afterthoughts and weave them together into a single, unbreakable, upward arrow of progress.
That is what actual resilient human development looks like.
It's not just about pushing the GDP number up. It's about the structural integrity of how that number is achieved.
If a country like VCT can engineer such high human development with significantly lower economic resources simply by prioritizing human capabilities, it fundamentally shames the global status quo.
It really does.
I mean, what is the excuse for the world's richest nations, whose immense wealth is increasingly failing to prevent their own life expectancies from stagnating or even declining?
That is the perfect provocative thought to end on. Think about that for a second. If raw GDP isn't actually the limit to how well humans can live and flourish, then maybe our biggest obstacle isn't a lack of resources.
No, the resources are there.
Maybe our lack of imagination is what's truly holding us back.
I think the data proves that.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the data. The next time you see a headline celebrating massive economic growth or a booming stock market, remember to look for the invisible taxes.
Always look under the hood.
Ask who is actually paying for it, whose labor is being discounted, and what we are permanently losing in the process. Keep questioning the numbers. Until next time.